After much anticipation, X Plus has finally revealed their Godzilla Minus One figures. Straight from Winter Wonder Festival 2024, today we're looking at the 30cm Godzilla Minus One figure and the Defiril Godzilla Minus One as well. Now, the X Plus booth this year at Winter Wonder Festival had some really cool announcements aside from the Minus One figures, but for the purposes of this video, I want to talk just about these two here. First with the 30cm figure, and then we'll take a closer look at the Defiril. For collectors like me, and I'm sure a lot of you who are subscribed and like to watch my content, I'm sure we were all eagerly awaiting these announcements from X Plus, and I gotta say, man, they did not disappoint. So, starting with this figure, we're looking at Godzilla Minus One in the 30cm scale. It looks pretty big, but these images are not going to give you a good idea of the true scale of this thing. I have a feeling that probably not long after this video, there's going to be the official pre-orders for these figures, so we'll get the true dimensions of it. But it does look really big. So we're looking at two versions, same sculpt. Only difference is one is the, I guess you could say, plain color version, the other being a atomic breath version. I'm not sure if they're going to go with the route of like a standard, a Rick, and then a G-Store exclusive. That seems to be the trend with more of their releases as of late. Now, personally, I prefer the standard color without any atomic breath color effects. But I will say that that pop of blue does look really nice in contrast to the rest of the coloring of Godzilla, especially since this version is pretty monochromatic for the most part. I mean, of course, you have your patches of color, but it is kind of just one overall consistent tone of color. With that said, though, in terms of the sculpt, this looks stunning. I mean, look at the level of detail that we got here. And with the size of the figure here, since it's nice and hefty, you're going to get a great look at all these little details. Every patch of skin, all the varying textures throughout the entire body, whether that be from the head, the chest, the back, all over. I just cannot wait to get something this size that really accurately represents Godzilla as he appears in the film. Now, in terms of the pose, I really like it. Of course, it does look like it is going to be a bit of a shelf hog because that tail really looks like it's just swinging straight out. But I'm not complaining. I like the overall pose itself. It does give a sense of motion. It looks like Godzilla is taking a step forward. And I really love that grabby hand look. They very accurately captured that look that is present in the film. That's one little detail that I liked a lot. Minus One is one of my favorite designs now. It's not my absolute favorite. That will still be Shin Godzilla, but he's pretty close, I would say. Pretty high up there on that list. And one of those details is the hands. I just love that sort of grabby look. It reminds me of Shin in a way. Even though Shin doesn't grab or have that grabby look, it still has a very clenched and tight look to it. And in terms of the head sculpt, this thing is stunning. I think they perfectly captured that very menacing, angry look that this version of Godzilla has. And like all my favorite versions and figures of Godzilla, this one seems to almost have an evil, angry grin, which I love in terms of aesthetics. You'll also notice that there is a tail stand included with this figure because it looks like the tail is pretty elevated. It does give a nice sense of motion. I've never really cared about tail stands. They don't bother me, but for those who don't like them, sorry to disappoint. It looks like it is going to be included with this version of the figure. Shifting gears over to this atomic breath version. Again, I'm not sure if this will be a Rick or G-Store exclusive version. You can expect that there will be some form of light up, I think. But this one in particular looks like it's semi-translucent. The dorsal plates, you can notice toward the tips of the dorsal plates that light seems to be kind of coming through a little bit. But I gotta say, I really love this shade of blue that they chose for not just this figure, but this design of Godzilla in general. It's a very nice, vibrant pop of color in contrast to the rest of, like I mentioned earlier, that very monochromatic coloring. And this particular shot too, you do get a better profile view of the figure, right? So we're looking at two different figures, identical sculpt, just to reiterate, but this is the atomic breath one here. Very nice pose. Again, you get a better sense of that side view here. The tail doesn't look super long from this side. He doesn't have the longest tail compared to more recent Godzilla's. Shin and Singular Point have very long tails. But that right arm you can see is coming out further than the left one, and it looks like the left foot is possibly coming out further than the right. I will say, though, that I think this front-facing shot, I think this is the standard version, you could see the atomic breath one behind it. This front-facing shot here of this figure, man, you could fool me because this is a 30cm figure. Doesn't mean it will be a true 12 inches. If this is in scale with the rest of 30cm figures, it's likely this will be maybe around a 10-inch size, which it looks a little hard to believe because it's honestly very hefty looking. But you could fool me and honestly tell me that this was a gigantic just based on the way that it looks sitting here on this display booth. But front facing, you can really get a sense of that chunkiness and all that texture, that evil grin, that kind of tilted downward pose on the head. And then there's just some additional shots here, kind of, again, at the side and back, just to show off the dorsal plates. We're kind of rotating between standard and Rick, or atomic breath versions, I should say, of the figure here. But I just want to give you a full sense of the texture here and the dorsal plates. One of my favorite sets of dorsal plates on a Godzilla. Just love that asymmetry, that larger one that's toward the top. It's just so cool. Kind of harkens back to that Millennium style Godzilla. This shot in particular does show that the eyes are actually pretty pointed down, so very on point. I love how tiny they look. These beady eyes really add that sense of creepiness to what is a pretty cool design. It really has that edge to it that just makes it that in-between cool and creepy. That's why I love this design so much. But I think by now you get the point here with this particular figure. The 30 centimeter looks to be a very exciting release. I cannot wait to get my hands on this thing. I'm expecting pre-orders are probably going to go up not that far from now. And I'll probably wind up doing another video on it just to give you those official images where they have like it lit up very nicely. This is much more sort of not natural lighting, but very much staged lighting. So you're kind of getting lots of overexposure in sections. But I really want to get those nice dramatic images that X Plus is going to put out sometime soon, hopefully. So now we're shifting gears from the ultra-realistic 30 centimeter version to the super deformed DeForReal Godzilla -1 figure, and man, do I have a lot to say about this one. I think I was just as hyped for a DeForReal release of -1 Godzilla as much as a 25 centimeter or 30 centimeter figure, and this one does not disappoint. Now, unexpectedly, this DeForReal is actually a train biter version of Godzilla. Now, I'm not sure if this will just be one standard release that just looks like this, or if there will be a Rick version. If there is a Rick version, I imagine that the train would be removable, or it would have a different mouthpiece entirely that lets you do a sort of closed mouth look. Honestly, though, I would pose it just like this, because it definitely is very different from that 30 centimeter figure release, and I'm happy that they chose to do so. Obviously, this is meant to be the version of Godzilla from the Ginza attack when he bites the train, a very iconic scene, and of course a homage to the original 1954 Godzilla. The train biter iterations of Godzilla have become sort of a trend, I think, among toy makers over time. It just has its own sort of appeal, but it does make this figure seem more dynamic. We have a very dynamic pose with this figure, I would say more so than even the 30 centimeter release. This one is very hunched over. His hands are in very different positions, and of course he has the train in his mouth, implying a sense of motion, and of course quite literally biting or eating into that train. And like the best of DeForReals, while it is super deformed, there is no compromise when it comes to texture and detail. This is just as detailed as the full sized up 30 centimeter figure, which is why I love these things, because yeah, sure, they're smaller and they're not for everyone, because it definitely is its own unique style, but I'm all over this thing. I adore the level of detail that is going on with this, and the train is just that cherry on top. And what's interesting to me is, as we look through these pictures, I feel like you could kind of see that sort of earlier stage of Godzilla as he first appears on Odo Island in the film. This DeForReal kind of captures that sort of Godzillasaurus look at certain angles, and I think partially that's because of how hunched he is, but then also certain angles remind me a little bit of the DeForReal Godzilla 2000 figure that they put out a few years back as well. And one thing's for certain, once this figure does release, I cannot wait to do a side-by-side with that Banpresto Godzilla that I actually did a review of a few weeks ago. That is such a great figure, but once you see this X Plus version here, it really is in a league of its own. There really isn't a series of figures or toys quite like the X Plus DeForReal line. Of course, chibi figures and super deformed versions of characters are nothing new with toy companies, but to me, and this is of course somewhat biased because I adore Godzilla figures, but I feel like X Plus really nailed that sweet spot in between chibi and super deformed proportions with that ultra realism when it comes to the detailing and the textures. This Godzilla -1 DeForReal figure is no exception. This looks like one of their best DeForReals yet, And I think for the most part here, you can kind of get a full sense of what this figure looks like. It'll be tiny, probably around 5 inches, a little over 5 inches at most, but it won't take up a lot of space, which is a plus. So if you're a Def Real collector or you're limited on space, this is definitely something to keep an eye out on. I'm curious to see, like I said, if there's going to be a Rick version or if it's just one standard release all around. Definitely keep an eye out for this figure and the 30 centimeter as well. Pre-orders will probably be going up sooner than you actually think, because once they show these things, they follow up not that long after. And like I said, just like with the 30 centimeter figure, I will also do a follow-up with this Def Real once we have those official nice product images that are, in more dramatic lighting to give a better sense of what the figure looks like. This is really going to be it for the video. I hope you guys like it, but I really want to know what you think about these releases. Will you be getting both? Will you be getting the Atomic Breath version of the 30 centimeter figure? Which one do you prefer? There's a lot to talk about, I think, with these, and I think Godzilla -1, that particular design, has so much potential for some amazing figures. And don't get me wrong, I think that the SH Monster Arts iteration and the Banpresto Ichiban Kuji and that Chibi version as well have all been great figures, but now that X Plus has finally shown us what their versions look like, the standard has been set higher now, and I look forward to what other companies do with like realistic sculpts. I will say that the -1 design does benefit from realistic sculpts just because of how textured and detailed it is. So for a company like X Plus, going into this, I knew that these were going to be some stellar releases. I know Easy Hobby did tease, I believe, an Alpha Kaiju series -1 figure. So for those who are not familiar, those are like around 20 inches tall. So that'll be our first foray into more gigantic scaled figures, I guess you could say. So anyway, these are my thoughts on these figures. Even if these were the only two that were announced at Winter Wonder Festival from X Plus, I would not have been disappointed. Honestly, these are the showstoppers for me. Of course, that Godzilla 84 that they announced, I will be doing a video on as well, because I think that is such a cool, unique release. There's some other figures that I'll probably do a video on a little bit from now, so keep an eye out for additional videos regarding these announcements from Winter Wonder Festival. Anyway, if you're new to the channel and you like the content, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and taking a look at my other Godzilla figure content on the channel as well. Lastly, thank you very much for watching, and have a good one.